My name is Angus, and I'm a PhD researcher at Heriot-Watt University. My supervisor is actually Arash, who you heard from earlier, and he covered quite a nice bit of ground that I then don't need to talk about. So it wasn't planned, but fantastic. In the top right, I'll do my sales pitch. If you want to follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn, I'm happy to chat to everyone. I want to see what everyone else is up to, and my time is to convince you that I've got something worth saying as well. So without further ado, I'd argue that we adapt to voice assistants, and I think it's not actually a tough crowd. I was speaking to a lot of you earlier, and we do. There's all these disfluencies that Arash talked about, where we'll say, "Oh, my hands are wet. Can you chuck on a timer for a couple of minutes?" Whereas I would say, "Kane, set a timer for 2 minutes." It's weird and awkward, and it's not how we speak to each other. And we remove these conversational phenomena, and we clean up our speech. And that's how we have learned to use these systems. That's the best way to get what we want from them. I actually talked to someone earlier that was saying that they used Amazon Alexa for speech therapy because it forces you to enunciate what you're saying very, very clearly. And there's also this idea of turn-taking. When we are talking to each other, we have nods and uhs and yes and all these things mid-conversation that we don't just say our sentence and then sit and wait for you to process and reply. We have a sort of back and forth, ongoing conversation, word by word, over in real time. But what about older adults who haven't adapted, haven't used these systems, they're not experienced in knowing how to get what they want from these systems, or people with cognitive impairments that have to now learn to adapt to these assistants that arguably benefit them more than us. It's great that I can set a timer when my hands are dirty, but these people can set reminders for things that they often forget, to take medication, or heat up their bedrooms when thermostat control panels are more finicky and confusing, just by asking for them. So how about we try and adapt the assistants to the user? And that's essentially what I've been trying to do for 3 years, but and ongoing. So dialogue changes as cognition declines, and this is one user group that I'm particularly focused on, and that's people with dementia. So these phenomena that we're talking about, we all generate them every day in all of our conversations, but people with cognitive impairments, as they progress, these phenomena become more common and more pronounced. So for example, they'll pause more often in a sentence and for a longer duration. And they'll say things like, "Can you get me the thing in the oven?" because they forget the word for chicken. So if these phenomena become more common and more pronounced as cognition declines, and we have learned to filter these from our speech in order to get what we want from these voice assistants, it's sort of definitely an area that we need to look at. And to note, this is from data of monologues, so people with dementia describing pictures or in interviews which are, what did you do yesterday? Not fluid, everyday spontaneous conversations that we would have or interactions with an assistant. But I've seen these phenomena in Alzheimer's Scotland centres with Alexa and it misunderstanding because of some of these phenomena. So another group are people with visual impairments, and I supervised like 30 MSc students over 2 years to try and make a voice assistant that can do some things for people with visual impairments better than currently. So that was a great sentence, you can tell I'm tired. We were looking at packaging. If you're in the kitchen and you have a cereal box, maybe you're allergic to nuts and you can't read the ingredients on this box. So maybe an assistant that could say, is this safe for me to eat? And I go, it doesn't contain nuts, but it's out of date. That was one thing that one group worked on, and all of these projects use Raza, by the way. And they're all integrated together. And the other group worked on sort of guiding people in the kitchen. So if you ask, where's my wooden spoon, and it says it's next to the plate, well, the next question is, where's the plate? It's not useful. Whereas there are anchor points in the kitchen, like microwaves and sinks, that you can use to navigate, that people know their own homes. So that was a couple of papers, and not the focus of this talk, but another user group that we can adapt these systems to great benefit. One other sort of last point I'll make here is I went to a respite care home recently in North Berwick. It's me on the right there, and I talked to a gentleman with MS. And slowly over time, he lost his independence because as MS progressed, he had to walk with a stick, and then in a chair, and then one of his arms stopped functioning as before, and he had to get a specialized chair that he could use with one arm. And he was saying that they got Alexas in this respite care home, and that night, he said, "Alexa, turn off my light." And something that we all do every single day, without thinking about it, he has to ask someone for like 20 years to come and turn that light off. And for the first time, he regained a little bit of his independence. And I didn't tell that story as beautifully as he did, but yes, anyway, it motivates this work in adapting to specific user groups that, again, I argue, get the most benefit from these systems. But we need data. And this is actually Arash and I in Edinburgh Medical School next to the hospital with a data collection we were going to do that was cancelled. So we spent about a year designing the task, ethical requirements, devices, sort of finding a place, working with charities to set up this data collection. It's still postponed, but during lockdown, I creeped out my flatmates, basically, by sitting, soldering and drilling boxes to create a capture device. Amazon kindly gave me 20 Alexas that I have now been able to put into people's homes with dementia. Along with this device that's separate, it also activates on the wake word Alexa, and it captures these interactions. And from this data, I'll be able to find out when there's misunderstanding, what phenomena in their speech causes that misunderstanding. How should we prioritize these adaptations? And this is ongoing. They're currently in people's homes, and we've got some of them back. It's very exciting. One note about this device, it also took ages because a device that records and live encrypts so that someone can't come and take these boxes or this box if it was lost. People can't access recordings of someone in their own home. Doesn't really exist, so I'm hoping that, basically publish this so other people could maybe use this in their domains. So I've heard from healthcare domains, mental health domains, where people are talking about things that are very personal, and if that got lost and someone else heard that and had identifiable information, that would be very problematic. So that's something I'm hoping to do. But we expect to find, frequent long pauses, as I mentioned earlier. So can you turn up the, and forgetting this noun phrase. Repetition, sort of, I want to, it's much more common, and self-correction, and again, these anaphoric expressions like the thing in the oven. We expect to find these, but there are going to be things that we find out because this data does not exist. And so, tying into sort of my other side of the PhD of doing something about this, without the data, thanks to COVID, we've sort of looked at the research currently. And I believe that the next generation of conversational AI systems needs to be incremental. That is removing this turn-by-turn sort of interaction that's not natural. It's not how we talk to each other. And as Arash talked about, processing things word by word. And if I'm talking to my grandma and I say something like, and I put this on GitHub, and she scrunches up her face, without saying one word, I'll explain what GitHub is and then come back to my point. I change what I'm saying while saying it in real time based on just a sort of furrow of the brow. So that's something that makes things more natural to interact with. Reason incrementally, I'm going to maybe talk about this in the future work section, but essentially going beyond what is just said. If these phenomena happen, there's a ha and also a brow furrow, then we know it's confusion and not, interesting. So being able to reason across these phenomena as they happen in real time, and then being transparent and controllable ties back to a lot of talks I've seen over the last few days. If something goes wrong, we need to know why it's gone wrong. So there was a research from a colleague of mine at Heriot-Watt also called Verena Reiser and two of her students, where they showed an assistant a bottle of medication and asked, "What is this?" And it said, "This is seasoning." Now, imagine if this was a person who's affected by sight loss, then you can't be telling people that seasoning is that medication is seasoning. It's detrimental. So we need to be able to very quickly understand why it thought this, and make it controllable so that we can change that reasoning and go, okay, we can fix this problem. Much like Alexa and other systems do on the output, it will not swear to you, even if their data-driven models come up with a swear word. It will tell you to put coins on plugs, but it won't sort of say these offensive material. They have this layer on the output that stop that from happening in order to protect themselves, and so do all of the big companies. But I sort of propose putting it a controllable layer at the start. So we have these great models, these NLU models that are understanding what people are saying, but I argue that they're not that transparent or controllable. So if we can have a layer there that we can tweak, then that would be fantastic. And this slide, I'm not going to go too in-depth on it because I'm not sure about how much time I am going to take. But essentially, this is a linguistic framework that Arash and his colleagues of this DS community of linguists has created to, as words are being said, represent these. And we're combining this with RDF, which is a big knowledge graph. This graph on the right is the linguistic linked open data cloud. Each of these little circles is a whole ontology built by linguists and maintained by linguists that we can hopefully plug our system into if we can output sort of a graph representation of what is being said as it is being said. And we actually managed to get a demo of this working, thanks to a lot of hard work by Arash. This dynamic syntax is extraordinarily confusing. And I'll go through an example parse here. So if someone says the word Jane, what do we know? Well, we know that there's this person labeled Jane, and the H we can actually ignore in this example. It's a dynamic syntax thing. But yes, that's all we know. We just know that there's this agent, or this person, Jane. Jane drinks. Okay, well, we know there's this action happening. There's this drinking action where the agent is Jane, this node, and we know that they're drinking something. Soup, water, lemonade, we don't know, which is why we can have this node here, but it's underspecified. We know that they are drinking something, but we know we don't know, and that's an important thing to note. Jane drinks water. This next token comes through. We can describe, okay, we now know what Jane is drinking. And Jane drinks water quickly. Well, we can modify that. We now know that Jane is drinking water very fast. She's been on a run, maybe. And we have this sort of working. And even for a more complicated sentence like Jane, who likes Bill, watched the dog that Bob caught. Yeah, that was actually an example we tested in a demo the other day, and it worked. It had all these different actions with the correct people in the correct places. So we have this graph representation of what is being said in real time as it's being said word by word. It doesn't cover many words at the moment, but that's what's next. So we want to extend our lexicon. We want to be able to cover more words. We want to use data to try and basically bootstrap this lexicon to be wider coverage. But it's not going to be as wide coverage as these neural models. If you say a word that it doesn't know, it won't understand. So as of on Monday, I will be going to do an internship at Amazon for 5 months, where I'll be doing exactly that, trying to use these transformer models to output these graphs again. But instead of word by word, just if Alexa stops mid-sentence, and instead of just responding with, I don't understand, trying to come up with some representation like the one you saw there with this underspecified node, so then it can know, okay, this is what we missed. So can you turn up the, and we know that they're wanting to turn up something, and it can maybe suggest. And that's how humans do it. Again, I haven't analyzed the data enough to release a paper and prove this, but in Alzheimer's Scotland resource centres where they have Alexas, that is what we see. We see them pausing before the last word because they've forgotten this word. I do this, again, all the time with music. And we can predict, okay, well, the TV is on, and music's not on, heating's not on, so, oh, do you want to turn up the TV? Yes. It's much more natural than, I don't understand, and then this person having to learn to start their whole sentence again from the beginning. Then, with this neural approach and this data-driven approach, we're hoping to compare the two on this data we're collecting or data sets that exist right now, and we're going to find that these neural models are going to cover a wider range. They're not going to break as easily, but they're very likely to, it's what's called hallucinate. So if you get transformer models and you give it data on a football match and you ask it to output some text to summarize this football match, it may say something like, oh, and Tottenham came back and scored in the second half, whereas they might have scored in the second half, but they didn't come and take it back. That's just made up, that's learnt from the input data that you trained it on. So it's sort of making things up. And obviously in the mental health domain, driving. I think there's a lot of people working on conversational AI for driving. It's also another one where you might not want to make things up. It's a lot more of a cause for concern. And then maybe a linguistic approach where you've had a lexicon that covers a specific domain would be more suitable, because then, you're not going to make things up, essentially. But we'll find out in the evaluation. And I had another point that came to my head. But then I've got a research position after this Amazon internship, thankfully. And what we're going to do is add in this visual side of things. So if someone says, Jane drinks that, there's a pointing action. I can represent what's happening in another graph. And because it's an RDF, there's these incremental reasoning engines that I have a lot of experience with. And you can do, Jane likes, or Jane drank soup. And that's what we're hoping to do with that. So trying to reason across modalities in real time as it's happening, comparing these two different approaches to see, which one's best for which use case. I think that's essentially all I was going to say. But this transparent and controllable layer will allow us to tweak our system's understanding based upon the data we collect and reasoning across modalities in real time, and ultimately adapting the voice assistant to the user. And that's what I forgot to say. Both of these systems output this graph representation. So even though we're using a transformer, we have this layer where we have some representation of the understanding that we can then tweak this reasoning of. So from this data we're collecting, we find that a particular speech phenomena is very important and causes a lot of misunderstandings. We can tweak at that point and go, okay, we've detected that has happened, and then flag that to the system. So that's something that, we hope to do. And in both of those cases, that's possible because of knowledge graphs, and I'm very biased and love them. So thank you very much. And I actually feel like I was on time. I thought I was going to go over.
Thank you. One quick correction. Tottenham didn't win 2-0. Actually, Middlesbrough beat them last night 1-0, but we don't win very often, but we did last night. What is the output of this? Like, once you go to Amazon, you prove out this methodology, you kind of publish the fact that, let's say everything goes to plan, and you publish that this is doable. Mm-hmm. What's the output of that? Do you imagine this being like some kind of open source framework? Is it something that is sold to something like Amazon? Is it like, what's the end game of it? Like, where do you see it manifested, and how do you think it will progress after the research?
Yeah, so speculation, because I've not even started yet. But I proposed this project, and one of the conditions of going and doing this would be that it is publishable. So it's in the open domain. So if it's successful, I know roughly what I'm going to plan to try and do. We will describe exactly what we did, evaluate it on data sets that exist. We've looked at some of those as well. Publish the results, and yes, it should be, reproducible. That's the idea anyway. Or it will go wrong, and it's a terrible idea, and And, do you have it further? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm just really excited to actually see that this is going to become the year of the entity and the knowledge graph, because I've heard the word knowledge graph dropped in at least 5 presentations already. I'm really excited about this. There's one thing I wondered though. This graph is really kind of geared towards linguistic functions. So, that's something you can also do with certain parts of NLP, NLU. What's the advantage of doing it this way?
So you're completely correct. There's my other supervisor is, I think, whole thesis was on AMR, it's called, and they're very similar. There's also graph representation. There's a lot of work in that area. The reason why I chose RDF is one I know the most. I've spent years working on it. But two, there are a lot of tools and resources that you can use on top of that. So that linguistic linked open data cloud, you can plug into those. So they have, I'm trying to think of a good example. There's a representation of word cloud, which is maybe not that exciting, but just being able to go, I have this word, what are all the synonyms? And it's there in this graph already. But one of the main reasons is this incremental reasoning engine is specifically designed to work in real time. So even if you have a huge graph, you add one piece of information, it will only update, as the part that's needed.
Just so exciting. It's really like Back to the Future, isn't it? This is what we've been talking about for like 20 years already, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, knowledge graph.
Again,